Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Bottom Line. I'm your host, Lauren Kalil. If you like listening to us chat about CrossFit news and everything that's going on in the sport, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel. On today's show, we have sports analysts Brian Friend and Tommy Marquez here to discuss some of the inconsistencies and standards with standards and penalties that we've been seeing from the CrossFit quarterfinals. Now, the CrossFit Games leaderboard, it's not official until at least the earliest on Friday. They recently put out over 100 penalties after starting the process of video review. Tommy, as somebody who has close ties with CrossFit Home Office, is this normal for CrossFit to put out these videos before the process is over?
You mean like the penalty article, or sorry?
Showing the list of penalties that they had on
Yeah.
their website and from certain workouts.
Yeah, that's actually a new addition to this year, and that was a direct result of some feedback that they've gotten to start releasing penalties and clarification on some of those things earlier. Because, as is the case with some of these quarterfinals workouts, when we're not in live competition and you're not seeing things play out in a group setting like you do with your peers at those live events, a lot of times athletes feel as they get punished or penalized, they feel like they're kind of on an island, and they tend to give this feedback that like they feel like they're the only ones being penalized. And so there's been an effort, and this has been directed to me from people who are involved with this, that they're making an effort to not only publicize that, but also showcase to these athletes in closer to real time that like you're not the only one getting penalized. This is a standard that's being held more consistently across the board, and that was shown through like the bevy of penalties that we saw on a event 2. I think 106 came on event 2 alone out of the 120 that they published so far. So there is actually an intent behind not waiting till everything's done to release it, to get some of that information in the hands of people sooner, and start to be a little bit more transparent with that.
When it comes to seeing how much the community is responding to what they've seen and with these penalties, do either of you think that maybe at this point they should go back to the old way, that it's more bad than good, looking like they're a little disorganized?
Well, that's a confusing question, but I will say this. It's what I hear from Tommy here is that they are, whoever this team is, the CrossFit Games team, is trying to do the right thing here. They're listening to athlete feedback, and they're trying to make a change to the way that they administer these competitions, these virtual competitions, that is something that the athletes can feel good about. And the thing that I have kind of learned now, after, I was very happy to see that they released all those penalties. I think that it's great that they're communicating that. I think athletes, analysts, fans, everyone wants to see those things, because otherwise it's just kind of weird. Like, we don't know what's happening and what's going on. There's a few things about that release that I think could be better, though. And it's not like a direct criticism. This is a positive step, but I think there may be a better way to do it. Some of the things that I know people were confused about is that the time penalties weren't all the same for all those athletes, even though what it said on the release was very similar or the same. And some people were receiving 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute penalties, but it would just say major penalty for lack of extension or depth or whatever their grievance was. The other thing that that Tommy said is the video review process is not done, and they've released that list. So what might make sense to me is because the quarterfinals actually lends itself to this perfectly. There are 3 different windows to submit scores: workouts 1 and 2, workouts 3 and 4, workout 5. So as the games team, you may also have the opportunity to release penalties in that order. Here are the penalties for workout 1 and 2. All the video reviews are done for this workout, and this is the list of people that we've penalized. Then it's very clear, it's done and dusted, and there's no questions, and everyone can see that. And if the athletes are nervous about it, and they're receiving their penalties before that's being released, and they're like, well, why me? Then maybe just come up with a communication form and say, any athlete in quarterfinals gets this email, and it says, we will be assessing penalties in a 3-step process based on the order in which you have to submit workouts. You will receive a notification if you receive a penalty or if your submission is good. But rest assured that we're reviewing a lot of videos. You're not alone if you do get a penalty, and we'll have a full list of penalties when we complete the review process for each set of workouts.
And I think that we all can agree that we want to see more transparency within CrossFit. The fans want to see more transparency. It gives them an insight to what actually is going on behind the curtain. But my question comes from when you see the CrossFit Games Instagram account put out a video with poor movement standards that aren't meeting the standard, like Griffin Raleigh, Samuel Quant. We had the overhead squat, the bench press, and then where the dumbbells were being head. Tommy, how just from your inside understanding of this, how could something like this happen when us as athletes know that these were poor movements?
Yeah, I can actually take some direct responsibility and accountability for some of this because I was involved, particularly in the Game Central video that included Griffin Raleigh's movement. And really, what it was a breakdown in communication on our part and some of the oversight that would typically happen before that gets published in the past. So now, obviously, in the past, we had a an in-house media team where as these shows are being built, and in any live environment for that matter, you get to see the highlights, you get to pre-approve video, you get to see all this stuff that's being used. Now, unfortunately, the changes have happened since then, and even though I get to be involved in some of the production of that stuff, we're not in-house media, and so the workflow looks a little bit different. um, I wasn't as involved in that particular Game Central, but I shoot my segment. I don't see any highlights. I speak. I don't get to speak to video. I write my stuff and I work through it, and then that stuff gets added in on the back end. And sometimes those editors or production assistants or people that are inputting those videos, they don't have a full understanding of what like CrossFit Games movement is. Like, they're familiar with CrossFit too, but sometimes you're pulling in editors for their technical capacity and not their knowledge of CrossFit per se. And then on top of that, there isn't as clear a line of communication over like, hey, these videos are good to go, versus like what they're just trying to pull on their own accord to be proactive. And so where that all comes to a head is on the back end when that video is getting prepped for release. There's a responsibility that lies in the people that are involved. That's myself, that's Sean, and we've said this publicly on our podcast that we just recorded, to double check and make sure we do our responsibility in making sure that video is good. And we didn't do that, and that falls on us, and that's our own responsibility to look at. We shot our segments, we signed our parts off, and then we continued on with our day. And the reality is that the overhead squat and the bench press in particular, like that's questionable movement. That's not a judgment on Griffin as an athlete or as a person, but it's just like that's not something that should have been publicized on our end if we're trying to highlight some of those things. And that's just part of that communication process that we're figuring out as we enter in this new world, I guess, of how things are being produced on that end. And that's part of the accountability process that is required across the board, from athletes, from judges, from media, from all that. And that's honestly what happened. And I mean, there's not really much more to say to that.
Well, and it's somewhat unfortunate because this year in particular, with the decision to get rid of the guy who's always programmed these workouts and been the head of the sport, there's a lot more scrutiny. People are asking questions. They're being critical. Can these guys do it? Is Bosman good enough to program? Is this games team that and we know is mostly the same people equipped to manage this season? And unfortunately, they've had some hiccups early in the season that are really, really, shedding negative light on them. This is the third time now with this Game Central thing that there's been some written standard that hasn't matched a visual or verbal standard that's been communicated via Game Central on Instagram by Adrian Bosman. And that's, it's happened 3 times through 2 stages of the season on a macro level like this. Just looks really bad. It doesn't mean that these people are ill-equipped to manage the game season, but it's just bad timing for them. The community being more critical than ever, people asking more questions than ever, and they're just happening to make these mistakes. So I kind of feel bad for CrossFit, but on the other hand, I'm like, you guys, it just needs to be better. Like, I don't know what the lines of communication are there, but I don't think there was any rush to get that Game Central video out, especially knowing that. Well, no, especially knowing that that particular workout hasn't finished being reviewed yet.
That's why we always use the word unofficial.
Yeah.
I mean, you never hear us say something is official before it actually is, before the leaderboard is closed. That's why we say unofficial. That's why we include that verbiage in it, because there are timelines and there are things, there are deadlines for media and windows and things like that. You do have to hit on it. So I would push back a little bit on that, Brian. I get what you're saying, obviously, but there are time frames that you do have to hit, and that's why specific verbiage is included in it. And it's like, in the end, it's a simple fix. Like me or Sean putting our eyes on that before it went out would have easily fixed that. And we honestly didn't do it this week. And in this instance, and, as a result, people are going to, cause a stink and do all of that stuff. But, the reality is it's still an ongoing process, and CrossFit is still looking at that video specifically. So that is it's a very weird gray area between media and like scoring judging, I guess. And one that's, being worked on.
So I want to follow that up with kind of the elephant in the room. We've seen a lot of criticism with these are problems because of the new leadership and because the change of programmer, the change of so many things within the last couple of months. Are the people making these decisions, whether it comes to the communication with the videos showing poor quality or the review process, are these people who have been part of home office for a while, and this would have happened regardless of who was in the seat?
I don't know if it's as simple as an answer of that as that. I think Brian captured a lot of it, is that as in general, people have their magnifying glasses out. And I think the nature of discourse on social media is that people see a very limited scope of what's presented in front of them. And there is an inclination to react in real time or react in that instant without taking the time for context and bigger picture stuff and actually getting down to the bottom of stuff. Like, and listen, it goes with the territory. Like, I've been in this media game for quite some time. People throw around baseless accusations against me all the time, and most of which don't carry an ounce of water with them. But at the same time, it's like, a very minimal amount of research or understanding would lend you to a much different take than that. And you don't have time to dispel all of it. You don't have time there's not always time to like cater to every single one of those things. The best thing that can happen is continue to build on the transparency, continue to build on communication, and continue to prove through actions over time, and narrow that ratio or that percentage of mistakes over time through your body of work. And it's you hear the clamorings over the change in leadership and stuff, particularly with the games. But the reality is, like Brian said, a lot of people that are there have been there for a long time. And and even some of these mistakes and things that have happened in the past under the past regimes and other things. Like, people are not perfect. As much as we like to pretend they're, like, people and the systems are not perfect. CrossFit is still in its first 15 years as a sport. And we see professional organizations like the NFL, NBA, PGA across the board make significant mistakes decades into their tenure with billions of dollars behind their name. And so I think part of it too is reframing what the expectation for this is, and in attempts to hold people accountable and be better, be more inquisitive, and act in good faith rather than in bad faith. And I think that's a big difference.
And it's like Tommy said, this is not something new. Like, there have been disputes about judging and movement standards and just the overall inclusion of certain movements in virtual competitions going back all the way to the first Open. If I'm not mistaken, that was the only time that push-ups were in the Open. Yep. And it was a problem. It's a very difficult movement to judge. There should be a pretty clear standard, but if you've ever been an affiliate when there's no push-ups, it's very difficult to get people to do it the right way. And as a result of that, CrossFit made the decision not to include push-ups ever since.
So just this 1 year. Yeah.
2011. There they are. We haven't seen them ever since. This is the second time, in a massive, pool of athletes that we've had pistols. We had them also in one of the workouts in 2020 in the Open. I think it was 2020.
20.4. Yep.
And then obviously this year. And this year, there's a litany of penalties pertaining to either depth or extension of the pistol. And as Tommy mentioned, a lot of the athletes who receive those penalties have videos available or portions of videos available where I don't want to say that the reps are good or bad. What I will say is it's very difficult to discern the difference between a good rep and a bad rep. And from my perspective as CrossFit Administrative Games team, that would be a movement that I would say, do we really need this movement in an open or quarterfinal stage? Or is it something that we can reserve for live competition? Because here we see Christy O'Connell, who had the 8th fastest time amongst women in the world, and Noah Olson, who had the fastest time in the world, I think, until he received a major penalty.
Mm-hmm.
Both of them are moving fast. I do think there's a small difference here, and Christy is, being a little bit more deliberate with the hip opening at the top than Noah.
Agreed.
But it's really hard to tell. And if you flip the camera angle and you could only see Noah from behind and Christy from the front, we also don't know, what it might look like. So it's a really nuance. And my question to CrossFit would be, do we need the pistol in this stage of qualification to find a good group of athletes for the next stage of competition if it's going to cause so much controversy?
So do we think that certain movements should be saved for in-person competition rather than an online qualifier where you have a video review?
I would tend to lean towards that. I think that, in general, there are high volatility movements that just having the instant feedback of the judge in real time makes it better overall. And I think that's part of the fine tuning process. My knees would greatly appreciate not having to do pistols anymore, just because I got a lot of city miles on this, on this old Toyota Corolla of mine. But I think that's just part of the process too. Like Brian brought up a good point about push-ups as well. And I also think there's this ebb and flow that goes with judging in particular as resources, are gained and lost, right? Like we always, and I there's this weird kind of in-between stance where like you kind of have to try and keep your finger to the pulse on what people really want. Because you hear people like, oh, we want a more fair and equitable competition. We want judging to be more strict. We all want this. And then, something like this happens where, okay, we're going to be a lot more strict and a lot more penalties get handed out. And people then go, oh, wait, no. That's like, not me, like that, them. And it's like, okay, where is that line here? It's like you ask for more and then you get more and you don't like the results, so you rally against that too. And there's like that, and that goes with the territory I get. And there's always that ebb and flow too. But it's I think that some of it can be evolved with, maybe we don't do pistols as much, or one-legged squats in something like individual quarterfinals, or maybe we save it for age groups where the cut is much higher and the attention to detail is expected to be a little bit more because of the implications of the cuts. But, that's not my say, but I do think that there are certainly movements that present a higher risk for stuff like this.
I think the last thing that I would ask about just the general reviewing process is, it seems to me from the outside perspective that there's a more critical eye on some of the workouts than all of the workouts. Because in the first workout, for example, you've got 3 different versions of handstand push-ups and 3 different versions of lunges. And both of those movements can be scrutinized to a very high level of extending the hips as you pass through on any of the versions of the lunge. And the extension of the handstand push-up has always been a bit of an issue and disputed. But there were really few penalties in that workout relative to the pistols and muscle-ups, which makes me think, and it's kind of a larger question, that they invested more resources into workout 2's review than workouts 1 review. Now, some people might immediately think that's a problem, and maybe it's a problem, but we also have to keep in mind the big picture. There's potentially 15,000 people submitting 5 workouts over the course of a weekend. What can we realistically expect them to review? And in the past, they've sometimes asked for only a select number of videos. And other times they ask for all of them, and it seems like zoom in on a couple of them. So I don't know necessarily what's going on behind the scenes, but from an outside perspective, I think that there's, and I don't know if today is the best day to talk about it, but I think there's perhaps more conversation to be had about maybe a better or a different way to go about just the whole process of administering this quarterfinal test. And I have some thoughts about that might share in the future, but for now, that's another inconsistency that seems to potentially be happening. That's kind of understandable, but also maybe a little bit frustrating for some.
Yeah. And one thing to remember is that this is only year 2 of this particular area of the system in general. And people that point to, well, you've been doing online competitions for quite some time, the size of the cohort matters in the application of the standards relative to the other stages too. Like in the open, typically, and this has been the case since the beginning, they may ask for 1 or 2 videos, right, to evaluate for people moving on to semifinals. In virtual semis or in other ones, it's very easy because the cohort is much smaller. This is kind of an in-between area. And I think that there's, like Brian said, there's a discussion to be had about, hey, what are the best practices here and how can we improve upon the product for sure? And I know those discussions are happening internally, and that's something that's always going to happen. Brian's worked behind the scenes with some of those people at the games as well. And I just think that there's going to be a fairly unique solution to that compared to what the solution is for open and semifinals, if there is a virtual or last chance qualifier. And that's still being worked on. And I think the tendency in today's day and age is it's like, hey, I call it the Veruca Salt problem. If you remember Charlie and Chocolate Factory, they always want it now.
Oh, yeah.
I want what I want, and I want it now.
Daddy, I want it now.
I feel like you've practiced that, Lauren.
I love that movie.
I know, it's great. It's great. I'm more of a Mike TV guy myself, but yeah, and I think the inclination is like immediately now. Let's do this. Why can't we have it this way? And it's like the reality is with most things, it doesn't always work like that.
How can athletes distinguish what the standards are when the communication is coming out one way with a written standard and then a separate way with a visual standard? We saw it starting in the open. It bled over to the quarterfinals.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, this is something that shouldn't even be a question. I was, and it was really the burpee standard and the deadlift that got me, that confused me, because I felt like I could read the standard and go do a version of the burpee that I would really not ever advise anyone to do. It's not the point of doing a burpee, and it would check all the boxes for what was written on the scorecard. But then, I'm not sure of the exact timeline of when Adrian Bosman's video came out that basically explained, like, listen, guys, we know this is what it says, but don't do this. That's not in the spirit of competition and what we're trying to do. You still should jump over the bar. That, and I that's not to me, that's not the way to go about it. Like, the written standards needs to be enough. And in the past, it always has been enough, where they could say, don't forget to check the written standards that are accompanying the scorecard before you do the workout. And in every other instance of the open, I would read through the standards, and that's where I would look for my, like, this is it. If I meet these standards, I'm good. So athletes shouldn't have to answer that question, in my opinion. The competition committee should have a clearly written set of rules that's provided on the scorecard there. If they want to have accompanying visuals, videos, whatever, they should always de facto back to that as the standard, whatever was written and provided to everyone.
Was there an example outside of that particular one that came to mind? Because that was the only one that really stood out to me.
No, I think just like the Games Central that was released recently that had what I would say is 3 examples of athletes doing movements in that video that were clear violations of the written movement standards.
Yeah.
Tommy, what is your bottom line to the inconsistencies and penalties we've been seeing?
Oh man, how much time we got?
I know. I feel like there's just
part of the show.
There's a lot. This has been a lot to unpack, and so many people have been like raising these questions that we're trying to be transparent.
I think, and this may be unsatisfactory for some people. I get it, but my bottom line is pretty similar to what it's always been. I think in the end, we need to understand that all of us want the same thing in this regard. I think everyone involved wants to have a fair competition. They want it to be run efficiently and be held to standards consistently across the way. Media wants that, the fans want it, the athletes want it, HQ wants it, the games teams want it, the mother, sister's brother of the 120 placed athlete wants that, and it's very easy to let other things cloud it in ways that aren't always like based in logic or big picture context. And ultimately, to me, that's kind of how I operate, and that's what I allow to guide my decision making and how I approach things. And I think that's just in general, that's ultimately remembering that will allow us to improve this in a much better fashion.
Brian, what's your bottom line?
I mean, we covered a lot here, and I think that there's a pretty clear understanding that we want CrossFit to be great in their communication, in their delivery, and in their application of their own rules throughout the season. But at the same time, like to Tommy's point, take a step backwards and you yourself think about if you were involved in the Open in any way and the community you were a part of, and if you were involved in quarterfinals in any way and the community that you were a part of. What I experienced was 5 or 4 phenomenal weekends of competition where people were challenged sufficiently, sometimes surprised themselves, set PRs, had a blast, grew closer together as a group of people. And that's the big story. And then these small things, yes, there are things we could certainly be better at as athletes, as judges, as CrossFit, yes. And it's okay to want to identify those and move forward, but don't let that be the thing that distracts you from the bigger picture, was that overall, I think the past 5 weeks have been successful. And for the most part, the athletes that deserve to be at semifinals based on their performances are going to be there.
All right, Brian Friend, Tommy Marquez, thank you guys so much for talking about the topic, and we'll see you next time.